Last December, the results from international testing in math, science, and reading were released in Washington, and Secretary Arne Duncan of the U.S. Department of Education made the statement that it's not just the other kids' children that are the problem, but it's your own. And there was a firestorm. People were very upset to hear this because it was very convenient for many people to simply say, it's a problem of poor kids. It's a problem of the inner cities. It's not our problems. Well, that discussion and the interaction with people about the results of the PISA test, the Program for International Student Assessment, led Paul Peterson, Ludger Woosman, and myself to try to go into more detail about just what U.S. performance was like. So what we did was to try to first just look where the U.S. stood among the developed countries of the world, the OECD countries they're called, and then to look at how the individual states did compared to the rest of the world. The results are actually quite astounding when we put them together. Overall, the U.S. in math performance comes out 27th out of the 34 developed countries in the OECD. But that's not the real story. The real story that we tried to develop was what happens if you compare our kids from poorer backgrounds, which we define as having lower educational background of the parents, or those from better backgrounds where at least one of the parents is a college graduate. When we do that, we find some astounding things that surprise a lot of people. It turns out that while the overall average for the U.S. is 27th, it's not the kids of low parental education that are dragging down the U.S. because the low performing, the kids from families with low educational backgrounds actually come out 20th in the world if you compare them to like parents. If you look at the graph where we've put the rank orders of countries in the world with the U.S. is in the bright red in the graph, and you can see that the U.S. for high educated parents falls below the middle of the graph because we're 28th in the world. But you can also see the individual states, so that a few states like Massachusetts come up near the top. They're the light blue state near the top of the rankings, and so they look competitive with the schools in other countries, also serving kids of families with a parental education of college. The interesting thing is if you look at California, where we live now, in California everybody is so convinced that we have a tough to educate population, but we're doing fine with everybody else. But then you see that the kids of college-educated parents in California come out behind Italy and Spain. Now we just do beat out Greece, but this is the set of countries that is in horrible economic and educational condition in the world, and California is right down with them. You can see them in the bottom right-hand corner, essentially, of this picture. So let me tell you what we did. What we did was to define different educational backgrounds of families and divide up the scores in the U.S. and in all of the other 34 countries so that we could see how did U.S. schools do with kids of different backgrounds, comparing apples to apples. It's very common now to compare apples to oranges, to say, oh, it's our poor kids and our poor kids are dragging us down, and then to compare our poor kids' performance to the average in other countries. And what we end up with is an answer that is confused by not comparing like families. We compare like families by mapping the scores of U.S. students to the world. and we find out that kids from families with low parental background, where none of the parents has a high school education, do relatively well in the world compared to the average. They're 20th. The shocker is, of course, when we look at families where one of the parents at least has a college education. In those families, comparing U.S. students to similar students in other countries, the U.S. comes out 28th. So instead of being just the poor kids and the kids from families without a strong educational background of parents, it's everybody. And that's the main story. If we're going to be competitive internationally, which we should be, we have to worry about the schools for everybody, not just the inner city schools. Our best schools are not doing a good job. This holds also when we go to advanced performance on these tests as opposed to the proficiency performance that I just talked about. It holds when we go to science or reading. Across the board, we have to improve our schools. It makes a huge difference for our future to have better educated people in our society.